All right, welcome to the Temple of the Silver Stars public webinar. My name is Matthew. I'm an academic track instructor in the Temple of the Silver Star. And this will be the fourth out of 6 classes in our Garments of the Infinite series, where we've been looking at the Sephiroth. So today's class will be very much a continuation of what we did last class. After the first 2 classes and establishing some of the basics and some of the core concepts, last week we really looked at the tree of life and started to build up structures and concepts and patterns on the tree. And we'll be going even further with that today. So if you remember at the end of last class, we had gone from these kind of cosmological and philosophical sort of abstract ideas. And at the end, we looked at the pattern on the trestle board. And I was suggesting that that was a nice way to begin to bridge the gap between these cosmological, philosophical, intellectual sort of concepts and the actual experience of your life and of being in the world and being a magician and all of that. So I think continuing along with that idea, we're going to help look at some things that are relevant to the individual, the constitution of the individual, and the makeup of the world. But very much building on what we did last week. I think everybody here was probably in the previous classes, so that's great. Yeah, definitely I recommend watching the previous classes if you haven't seen those already, because this will get a little bit advanced. And actually, of the 6 classes in this series, this class will probably be the trickiest one, or maybe not trickiest, but most complex. Yeah, so let's just jump right into it because we've got a lot to go through. All right, so I just wanted to start off with introducing something that I think is going to be one of the themes and one of the things to pay attention to across this class. So this is from the Emerald Tablet, which is one of the core Hermetic and alchemical documents that I'm sure many of you are already familiar with. The image there you see is from Heinrich Kunrath's Amphitheater of Eternal Wisdom, and he's got the entire text of the Emerald Tablet there in Latin. And we'll see some of the Latin too in a minute, actually a few times. All right, and then I've just got the translations of the first 3 verses of it, which is it's a short text. This is about a quarter of the text here in English. And this is from Isaac Newton's translation. So, "'Tis true without error, certain and most true. That which is below is like that which is above, and that which is above is like that which is below, to do the miracles of one only thing. And as all things have been and arose from one by the mediation of one, so all things have their birth from this one thing by adaptation." So the main thing I want you to get here, or to present here, is this idea of the as above, so below. That which is below is like that which is above, and that which is above is like that which is below. And we can see this, if you can see in Latin here, we have the quod est inferius est sicut quod est superius. That quod, superius, that which is above, and quod inferius, that which is below, and sicut is to be like. And so we'll see this Latin occurring a few times again as we go through. All right, so I wanted to talk a little bit about the different ways that this idea of the as above and so below is understood. This is often, put together with the terms of the microcosm and the macrocosm, right? And so the macrocosm is like the big cosmos, the big world, and then microcosm, or the microcosmos, is the small world. And so we have the idea that as in the big world, so in the small world. Sometimes this is as in the whole, as in the entirety, so in the part. But yeah, I think one of the things that we can talk about here is the way that the understanding of this changes through time. So on the left, I have, kind of a more traditional conceptualization of what the macrocosm and the microcosm are. Now, some of you will recognize this diagram from the last class. This is from the geocentric cosmology. So the center part, what I've labeled the microcosm, that's the earth and the world of the 4 elements, right? We have the earth, the water, the air, and the fire. That's the microcosm. And then the macrocosm is the celestial world, from the lunar world all the way up through the sphere, the zodiac and the sphere of the fixed stars. The celestial world is the macrocosm. And so, we can think about this as astrology is a nice way of approaching this idea that as the heavens revolve and the spheres turn, and the planets move through their different signs and different configurations, these produce changes in the world below us, or just that the celestial powers extend their influence into the this world, and then plants and gemstones and all of those correspond with celestial powers. That the things in the microcosm, with the plants, animals, events in human lives, parts of the personality, the parts of your life, they all correspond with things in the celestial world, so that this world reflects the celestial world. But then we also have another idea that we'll see as well, that instead of this being about the celestial world and then the planet Earth, we also have the idea of the individual human as a microcosm. So that the individual the structure of you and your being reflects the structure of the whole. And so I've got a diagram there. We'll come back to this diagram in a little while. This is mapping out the body onto the tree of life, and you can see the 10 Sephiroth there mapped from the top of the head to the feet. And again, we'll talk about this in more detail going on. You also have this idea in a lot of other, especially things coming out of the Greek and Hellenistic traditions. This is what, as we'll see in Kabbalah, that is called the Adam Kadmon, the primordial man. In Gnosticism, you have the anthropos, or the proto-anthropos, the primordial man. Similar ideas in other traditions, ideas coming out of the Platonic tradition. Even in the Indian tradition, you have the idea of like the Purusha, and more in the Vedic idea that what the Purusha is changes a little bit when you get into like the Samkhya and yoga philosophy. But again, the idea of a primordial human, and it's somehow because this primordial human is the map or the plan that everything else is created on, individual humans also reflect that structure. And so I have two quotes here from the Corpus Hermeticum, one of the key texts of the Hermetic tradition, talking about this idea of the primordial man. So the first one there says, in him, again, him here is the primordial man, or primordial human. In him, he had the nature of the cosmic framework of the seven, who are made of fire and spirit, as I have told you. Right, so the seven here are the planets. So the idea here that now this is the cosmic human, but every human also follows and participates in this same structure and has this same pattern, so that we all contain, insofar as we participate in the form, the eternal primordial form of humanity, and we also have the seven planets, the celestial powers within ourselves. And then I've also added another quote there from the Corpus Hermeticum, saying, he is androgyne because he comes from an androgyne father. So even though we're using the word, he and man here, it's clear that we're not talking about, male or female. We're talking about something that is both or beyond, prior to the division into male and female, or is both united. And again, with it's using the term, the Corpus Hermeticum talks about the father, the creator God, but it's clear that this doesn't mean father like a male father. It's just using the idea of fatherhood as a metaphor. So I've sort of called these, we have as above, so below, but I've put on the traditional model there, and then I've written as within, so without. That's just, I didn't come up with that phrase, I've heard that before, but sort of a way of talking about the idea that the inner expresses the outer. You'll see this in other places as well, even into the modern philosophy and the modern world. These ideas will show up in different forms. In Leibniz's philosophy, there's the idea of the monads, which are all sort of individual points that all individual like consciousnesses and intelligences that reflect every other point, so that every monad is a microcosm, and it reflects all of the others. So this is getting into kind of a holographic sort of idea about each individual thing replicating the structure of the entire thing. Even in the way Crowley picks up some of Kant's philosophy, you'll see this idea. Crowley talks about the idea that the microcosm and the macrocosm means that we can only, the universe for us, of course, is only what we can perceive. If something exists and there's no way for us to know about it, it may as well not exist. And so taking up this sort of Kantian idea that the sort of the overlap between being and thought is what is knowable, and that this is a kind of microcosm and macrocosm, that it's the overlap or the extent to which the interior reflects the exterior, that the exterior can be known. That's something I'd like to talk about more in future classes. But just know that this is a thread that you'll see all throughout. And again, you have these two, the understanding the individual as a microcosm, and then also understanding like the material world as a microcosm of the higher worlds. So I'm going to read a quote. This, I think, is a nice, helpful way of talking about some of these ideas. This is from an essay by John Michael Greer. I'm sure some of you know who he is. It's called Sources of Power in Medieval and Modern Magic. This is from a compilation of essays called The Celestial Art, which was published by Three Hands Press a couple years ago, and edited by Austin Kopic and Daniel Schulke. So anyways, in this essay, it's a really great essay. It has a lot of really important and interesting stuff here, but he's really contrasting the way that sort of medieval and traditional magic thinks about magical power and the sources of magical power, and then contrasting that with a more modern approach. So he's talking here about Eliphas Levi, who's writing in the mid-19th century and is one of the really important, foundations for the modern magical tradition. So he's talking about Levi's book, Dogma and Ritual of High Magic. He says, in that book, Levi showed that it was possible to take the philosophy of astrological magic and make it work in a Copernican universe. So if you remember from last week, we talked a lot about that, the shift from the geocentric model to the heliocentric Copernican model. So, Greer's talking about this same idea. What's more, he, Levi, did it by an act of decentering that more or less paralleled the one that Einstein carried out in physics half a century later. In Levi's theory of magic, the currents of creative force don't move in a single direction, cascading down from the throne of God, past stars and planets and the circle of the moon, to yank things here on earth about like so many puppets on celestial strings. The astral light, this is one of Levi's really big ideas, that of an astral light that pervades all things and connects all things, which again, it would be good to talk about in a class more focused on Levi at some point. So he said, the astral light, the unseen continuum that unites all things, communicates influences from everything to everything else, from the earth to the planets and stars, just as much as the other way around. And that was, in Levi's view, the basis on which magic rests. One implication of this shift in focus deserves special attention. The ways of thinking about the sources of magical power that were in circulation before the dawn of modern magic assumed, as already noted, that human beings didn't have magical powers. If you wanted to practice magic, you either had to figure out how to direct and concentrate the powers of the stars, or you had to figure out how to obtain help from or mastery over spiritual beings. For Levi, by contrast, human beings were capable of magical action in their own right. The astral light, the universal medium of magic, could be shaped directly by the power of human will, guided by the human imagination, without any need to call on other forces. All right, so I'll leave it there, and about halfway through, we'll come back and I'll read a little bit more from that same essay. But anyways, this is just sort of setting the tone and some of the themes I think that we'll see throughout this class. The rest of this class is going to be, this was a tricky class to present and tricky set of slides to put together. So, just do your best, sort of follow along and bear with me, and hopefully the pieces will start to come together. But there's a bunch of different things that all fit together in a complex way that we need to look at. All right, so we're going to start with the formula of the tetragrammaton. So I've got a quote here. This is from Aleister Crowley in a letter he wrote to Grady McMurtry. And he says, the one thing that never alters is the basic formula of Yod-He-Vav-He. Right? That's Yod-He-Vav-He, the tetragrammaton, the unpronounceable four-lettered name of God, from the Hebrew and Qabalistic traditions that we've talked about a number of times already. Now, in this particular letter, Crowley is discussing a particular set of magical techniques with Grady. And so this letter is pretty easy to find on the internet if you want to look it up. And you can see the original context for that. But I just wanted to highlight this importance of the formula of the tetragrammaton. Especially sometimes I've seen in people doing kind of more modern forms of magic, you tend to see that this formula as a little bit outdated or something like that. And I think it's pretty clear that for Crowley anyways, that was never the case. It always remains extremely important, and it's a real key to understanding the tree of life and the Sephiroth. All right, so let's look at a few things with the tetragrammaton. So coming back to the idea of the tetractys, the Pythagorean arrangement that we saw in the second class that links together the numbers 4 and 10. And so we saw that the 10 for the Pythagoreans is the completion of the decimal scale and has the sense of totality. But then we talked about how when you get to the 4, you are in a sense already there. Now, we saw the tetractys arranged for the Pythagoreans as this sort of pyramidal shape, just made of dots, right? And so you have one dot on the top, then two dots, then three, then four, and 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 is 10. Something I think I forgot to mention in that class was that the shape, right, that the tetractys makes, the upright triangle, is the same shape as the Greek letter delta, which is just written as an upright triangle. And delta has the value of 4. It's the 4th letter of the Greek alphabet, and so it has a numerical value of 4. So even there, you've got this connection between the 10 points, make the shape that has the value of 4. So again, this connection between the 4 and the 10. Now, obviously, for us, the 10 is going to largely be the 10 Sephiroth, and the 4 will be the 4 letters of the Tetragrammaton. And so you can see that the way that the Tetragrammaton has been spelled out, so that each line we spell, you have the first letter on the first line, just the yod, and the second line you have yod he, and then the third line you have yod he vav, and then the fourth line you have yod he vav he. There's some other interesting stuff with the tetractys that we don't really have time to get into. For one thing, you can put all of the Sephiroth in the shape. You could, arrange the Sephiroth in the form of the tetractys, and there's some really interesting patterns and things like that you can do, especially if you know some more detail about the way that the Greeks work the tetractys and the way they find certain mathematical patterns. If you follow those same sort of patterns along the Sephiroth, there's some really interesting stuff that can come out. But yeah, we just don't have time to get into it here. All right, so this here isn't super important, but I thought it was sort of interesting and illustrative of a point. So this is from Jakob Boehme. I'm not sure which specific work of his this is from, and I don't know that much about Boehme. It may have been something of like a personal emblem that he used. I'm not really clear. Boehme is I guess theosopher is probably the best term for him. Now, this is, of course, has nothing to do with the Theosophical Society. He's not really a philosopher. He's working a lot with alchemical imagery, but he's not really interested in alchemy. He's using this as a metaphor to talk about, really about the way that the evolution of the universe takes place within God, and the evolution of God and the nature of God himself. This can be talked about as theosophy, the understanding of the kind of study of God and the almost like the anatomy of God or something like that, the sort of philosophical structure of the divine. So anyways, you've obviously got the tetractys in the middle with the tetragrammaton. As we've seen, you have the yod he, yod he vav, and then yod he vav he. But what Levi's done, actually, let me back up. I'll explain the outer part of the diagram first. So around the outside here, we see Christus. Now, this is, Boehme is absolutely a Christian, and is all of this is happening in a Christian worldview. So he's got Christus there, meaning the Christ. Now, it's kind of hard to see, but written from the top point down here, it says Jesus, right? Jesus in Latin. And then coming down here, it says Emmanuel. And then you have the EL at the bottom. But the thing I thought was really interesting about this is that he's added below the tetractys, he's added an extra line here, which is yod he shin vav he, right? This is the pentagrammaton, which I'm sure most of you are already familiar with, the idea of a 5-lettered name that is, where the 4-lettered name is like the 4 elements, the 5-lettered name adds spirit into the middle with the letter shin. It's also, of course, that kind of fanciful or contrived or Qabalistic spelling of the name Jesus is the pentagrammaton. So anyways, not super important, but I thought it was a nice illustration of how, once you understand these patterns and how the patterns work, you can extend them. So you can take, the tetractys, the 10 points, and then add this extra line at the bottom because you're extending the tetragrammaton into the pentagrammaton. All right, so let's look a little bit more about at the tetractys, the tetractys and the tetragrammaton in some more detail. So let's see. Let's just start with the kind of the colored diagram in the lower left-hand side there. So I've got the yod he vav he, the 4 letters of tetragrammaton here in the column on the left. And now you see to the right of that, the attributions to the elements. So yod corresponds with fire, he with water, vav with air, and then he final corresponds with earth. Now these also can be placed on the tree, and that's what you see in the diagram on the right. So the yod corresponds most particularly with Chokmah. Yeah, that's Chokmah here. Excuse me. So yeah, so yod corresponds most particularly with Chokmah, but it's often said that the very top point of the yod corresponds to Kether. So yod kind of includes Kether, but most especially is Chokmah. And then the first Hey is in Binah. There, you see it there. And now the Vav encompasses the middle 6 Sephiroth. And this is a pattern we'll see a bunch of times today of the middle 6 Sephiroth there being treated as a unit. And so this is the Vav, right? So it's Hesed down through Yesod, but most particularly Tefereth at their center. So that corresponds with the the element of air. And then finally at the bottom, corresponding with the element of earth, we have the Hey final. Now these 4 also correspond with a family of father, mother, son, and daughter. So the son, is the Vav, the daughter is the Hey, and they're the children of the Yod and Hey. Now, yeah, and we'll see this logic coming back a few times of mother, father, son, and daughter. It's important not to make too much out of that. Some sort of complex things happen here, and the daughter is often the bride of the son, but there's no actual incest implied. It's just sort of different ways and kind of overlapping ways of personifying these different powers. Let's see. Okay, right. And then in the top left there, I've got the tetractys again. And there's an interesting pattern here that happens that relates the position of the tetragrammaton on the tree to the tetractys. So at the top line of the tetractys, you just have the 1. And so the yod here, this is sort of yod corresponding more to Kether, right? Because Kether is the first Sephirah. All right, and then for the 2 here, this is going to be the second letter. This is going to be like yod Hey, and most especially the Hey here. But 1 plus 2 is 3, and so this is the Hey is the third Sephirah of Binah. And then in the next line, now we've got Yod Hey Vav, and so most especially Vav here. And 1 plus 2 plus 3 is 6, and Tefereth is the 6th Sephirah. And then finally on the bottom line, we have Yod Hey Vav Hey, and 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 is 10. And so the Hey final corresponds to the 10th Sephirah of Malkuth. So yeah, I hope that's clear, but that all works out really nicely, I think. Yeah, so this is an important pattern, an important one to know, and yeah, we'll see it reoccurring a few times as we go along here today. All right, so let's shift gears just a little bit for a minute, and we'll talk about the idea of the 4 worlds. So this is a Qabalistic idea of there being 4 realms of creation, 4 worlds. Now, exactly what these things represent, and how they get used sort of varies between traditions. So you should be prepared to see some flexibility and some slight differences and disagreements in exactly how this stuff all works out. But this is the basic idea here, and you will see this all over the place, and it's very important. So the names of the 4 worlds, you have the Olam Atziluth. This is the world of the emanations. Olam HaBriah, the world of creation. Olam HaYetzirah, the world of formation. And the Olam HaAsaya, the world of action. Now, the world of emanations, Atziluth, the highest world, this is the realm of divinity, and it's also the realm of the Sephiroth in and of themselves. The world of Bria is also sometimes known as the throne. This is like the throne of God, the throne that the divinity sits in, and it also corresponds to the archangels and the archangelic world. Now, below that, the realm of Yetzirah, the world of formation. This is the angelic world. And then finally, the Asya, the world of action. Now, I have the world of the shells here. This is the Qalipoth. Sometimes the Qalipoth are attributed as part of the world of Asaya, almost occasionally even as like a secondary name for Asaya. That's a little bit confusing. That's not usually how we use it. But you can think of it as like the Qalipoth or shells, which we'll talk about more in a minute, as the lower portion of the world of action of Asaya. And sometimes they're pictured as another kind of pseudo world like below Asaya. So be prepared to see some variations there. But this is the manifest cosmos. Now, sometimes, especially in some Jewish sources, Asaya is still a little bit above the actual material reality itself. But in our tradition, Asaya encompasses the matter, and it's the world that we live in, the human world. It's everyone is aware of Asaya, and most of us, before doing spiritual work, are only aware of Asaya. We need to awaken to the other three worlds above that. And so that's how we use it, as the kind of ordinary world that we all live in. I mean, we live in all four worlds, but the ordinary world that we are aware of and conduct daily human life, or that occurs within, that's the world of Asaya. All right, so now let's look at two ways of picturing the tree in the four worlds. So on the left here, you've got a more traditional Kabbalistic way of Jewish Kabbalistic way of picturing it. So that the tree of life, the 10 Sephiroth, are just in Atziluth. And then below Atziluth, you have the other three worlds. So you have Beriah. That name for the second world there, the world of creation, I usually say Beriah, and that's a really common one, but I think Beriah, it's actually 3 syllables, so I'll try to say Beriah, but you'll hear it said both ways. So then you have Beriah, the world of creation, and then Yetzirah, the world of formation, and then Asaya, the world of action. All of those are below Atziluth and below the Sephiroth. So this comes back to some of the things we talked about in previous classes, especially the idea of Malkuth as kingship rather than as kingdom. I think it makes a lot of sense here if we've got the things arranged as they are on the left, that Malkuth isn't the lowest thing, right? Malkuth is the lowest part of the divinity itself, but is higher than everything else. And then it's from that point, from Malkuth of Atziluth here, that's the kingship, and is the faculty that the divinity then relates to all the other worlds and relates to manifestation through. So it's that power of rulership over what comes below. Yeah, and so this is something we've talked about it I mentioned this in a few of the other classes, this idea of the two different ways of viewing the Sephiroth in like a more restricted sense and then in a broader sense. So this is like the more restricted and traditional sense. Now on the right, we see like what the broader sense. And so this is all four worlds, the same four worlds again, Atziluth, Beriah, Yetzirah, and Asaya. But now the tree of life is in each of the four worlds. And so there's no contradiction between these two things. We just need to be clear about what we mean when we talk about the Sephiroth. So in the pattern on the right, we could think that, the Sephiroth in and of themselves are really just in Atziluth. The Sephiroth in Beriah, the Sephiroth in Yetzirah, and the Sephiroth in Asaya, those are reflections of the Sephiroth in Atziluth. So again, as I think I said before, when we're talking about a particular Sephiroth, like we were talking about, Tifereth, for example, are we talking about Tifereth in its own essence, in and of itself? That's, Tifereth within Atziluth. Or are we talking about everything that participates in that form, everything related to that form, everything that's some sort of descent of that original thing? Then we're talking about Tifereth, in all four worlds or across them all. So again, no contradiction. It's just, we just have to be clear about whether we're talking about them, in and of themselves as the parts of the divine essence, or whether we're talking about everything that participates in those fundamental patterns across the four worlds. All right, so here we've got a diagram that we've seen before. This is from one of Robert Flood's diagrams. And so I just wanted to come back to it. We said that last week. So I just wanted to come back to it and say a few things now with the concepts that we just built up about the four worlds. So he's got the 10 Sephiroth. Here's, Kether, Hokmah, Bina, Hesed, Gevurah, Tifereth, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, and Malkuth. But these are the Sephiroth, in Atziluth, the Sephiroth in and of themselves. Right, and you can see especially he's got the divine names. You can see Aheye, Yah, Elohim. The Sephiroth in Atziluth essentially are identical to the divine names. Now, so here's Malkuth, right, the bottom of the four Sephiroth in Atziluth, and now the palm leaves that are growing out of this. These correspond. There's 10 of them. They correspond to the 10 archangels. Well, he's got sort of the orders of the angels here, but anyways, the point is that blooming out of Malkuth, you have yeah, you have like the lower worlds, which are following the pattern of the upper worlds of the Sephiroth, but are not exactly the same as them. So hopefully that's clear that you know the archangelic and angelic worlds are below the Sephiroth proper, but are still founded on the same pattern. So in a way, this tree here is almost like somewhere in between those two different ways of looking at the Sephiroth that we talked about before. Yeah, so hopefully that's a little more clear and helpful. All right. Oh yeah, I think I talked about that a little bit last week, but yeah, I really love that in the tree. The way that the tree is it's rooted in the supernals, right? So this is Eheye. This is like Kether of Atziluth. This is the highest point of the divinity, below the absolute unknowable Ein Sof, right? And so the entire tree is rooted in that, rooted in the Godhead itself, and then grows downwards towards manifestation. So that if the tree were like growing out of the ground, what would be the highest point of the tree? If it was oriented the other way, would be like Malkuth in Atziluth, and then the blossoming or branching of that is the worlds below Atziluth, right? The world of Berea, and then Yetzirah, and then Asaya, sort of blooming or emerging out of Malkuth of Atziluth. I hope that's not too confusing. But yeah, it's interesting the way that the inversion happens, and that normally we think of Kether being like the highest, but here there's a sense in which it's the most foundational, and it's the thing that everything is rooted into, and then grows away from that. Yeah, I really like that a lot. Okay. So here's another way of talking about the Sephiroth, and also this brings us back to some of these kind of fractal as above. So of course in those patterns we just saw, we see that same logic of as above, so below. As in Atziluth, so in the lower worlds. As the divine names are structured, so the archangels are structured, and so the choirs of angels and orders of angels are structured, and so things in the material world are structured, right? That same pattern reflecting itself down the worlds. Now, another similar sort of thing that can happen is that each one of the Sephiroth on the tree can be looked at as a tree in its own right. So now you have a kind of fractal idea that each Sephiroth is its own tree of life. So if you've got a tree, you've got 10 Sephiroth, and then a tree which within, well, not just within, it's not that you have like a big tree and then 10 smaller trees. So it's not like a total of 11. It's that each Sephiroth like is a tree, or can be thought of as a tree. So if you think about each Sephiroth as its own tree, then you've got 10 trees arranged into the form of a tree, and so that's 100 total Sephiroth. And then now if we also look at the tree in all of the four worlds, that would be 100 times 4 is 400 total. So we've got 10, right, you've got like 10 trees arranged in the form of a tree in each of the four worlds is 400 total Sephiroth. And this number 400 is the value of the Hebrew letter Tav, which is the last letter of the alphabet, and as such has the symbolism of completion and of finality. It's also in the tarot, attributed to Tav, is the 21st Atu, right? And this is, traditionally the world, or in Crowley's deck, the universe. And so again, it represents that the final completed product, and also the totality and whole. So yeah, just a nice way of seeing that value of 400 and these symbols of totality and completion really get worked out. Now, for practical purposes, you're never actually going to be looking at like some, a set of things attributed to like the 400 Sephiroth. This is more of like a theoretical construct. Though the idea of Sephiroth layered within Sephiroth, you will see that showing up, especially in sort of complex ways in like initiatory systems and in other places. And it can be useful to remember that each Sephiroth can be broken down into an entire tree on its own. Yeah. But again, another manifestation of this as above, so below. Each Sephiroth is like a microcosm of the entire tree. which again, it has that fractal or kind of holographic sense to it. All right, now here's another way of, now instead of looking at the tree in all four worlds, we can also look at all four worlds on the tree, which again has this nice sort of layered, like fractal kind of quality. And so the worlds will get attributed, well, except for the lowest world, will get attributed to triads, triads on the tree. So the upper triad, we call the supernal triad of Kether, Chokmah, and Bina, that corresponds to the world of Atziluth. And then the middle triad of Hesed, Gevurah, and Tifereth, that corresponds to Beriah. Then the lower triad of Netzach, Hod, and Yesod corresponds to Yetzirah. And then finally, Malkuth corresponds to Asiya. Sometimes you'll see these triads given other names. There's sort of there's actually two different ways that like the triads on the tree can be named. I find it confusing because it sort of ends up overlapping like two different patterns that can be a little bit like misleading. But you will see sometimes, again, you'll see that the top triad called the supernal triad, that's a very frequent common one. Occasionally you'll see it called the intellectual triad. Now the middle triad there, the one that corresponds to Beriah, that will sometimes get called the moral triad or the ethical triad. And then for Yetzirah, you'll sometimes see it called like the astral triad, though that's sort of a weird addition from like a different way of looking at things. And yeah, so it gets a little bit confusing, but you will see that terminology. So it's helpful to be familiar with it, especially if you see references to like the ethical triad or the moral triad. They're talking about Hesed, Gevurah, and Tifereth. And it makes sense too, right? That Chesed is mercy, and Gevurah is like justice and strength. That those two things are like the two sort of ethical polarities, and that it's the balance and harmony. Tifereth, of course, is beauty and harmony. That between those things that creates like a properly ethical or moral behavior or attitude, or however you want to talk about it. Now, of course, we need to understand all of that in a thelemic context, right? Right. Yeah, I'm sure you're all familiar with those ideas about how Thelema sees, sort of ethics and morality in a different. Just not that those things aren't relevant to Thelemites, but that it's done in a different way, in a much more personal way, based, of course, on the law of do what thou wilt. All right, and then we've also got there in the color diagram there on the lower left, some of the basic correspondences to the four worlds. And so we see that the four worlds also correspond to the tetragrammaton. So Atziluth corresponds to the Yod, Beriah corresponds to He, Yetzirah corresponds to Vav, and Asiya corresponds to He final. As you might expect, you've got like these groups of four. Groups of four will tend to correspond with other groups of four. And so again, this is like we saw a couple screens back there. Atziluth is the world of divinity. Beriah is the world of archangels. Yetzirah is the angelic world, and then Asiya is the world of manifestation, or the world of action, the material world. And this pattern we'll see a lot next week when we talk about in a lot more detail about the hierarchies. You'll see divine names corresponding with Atziluth, and then archangels and archangelic names corresponding with Beriah, angelic, choirs of angels corresponding with Yetzirah, and then finally something that's called the heaven of Asiyas, which corresponds to like the celestial powers, the planets and the zodiac, all of that corresponding with Asiya. And so when you're calling up divine powers, you're following this scheme, this hierarchy, and it's also a kind of tetragrammaton formula of starting from the highest and then stepping down from the highest divine source to the world of manifestation. Or if you're just doing like a scrying or something like that, you're working in the Yetziratic world, you'd stop at Yetzirah. But yeah, this is that pattern. And if you were here for the last class series I did on the Paz letters and correspondences, you already saw that pattern a number of times of divine names attributed to the four worlds. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of a better theoretical or background for understanding those hierarchies. And again, that's something we'll see again next week. All right, so continuing on with the tetragrammaton and the four worlds together. Over on the left here, we've got the Tetractys again, and you can see that the four levels, as is probably pretty obvious, can be can be equated with the four worlds. So the yod at the top, and sometimes it's said that the tetragrammaton is, obviously, if it's less than 4 letters, it's not technically a tetragrammaton, but that it's only spelled with all 4 letters in Asaya. That in Atziluth, it's just the Yod. In Berea, it's Yod He. In Yetzirah, it's Yod He Vav. And then in Asaya, it's Yod He Vav He. And so that, again, goes back to some of that pattern that we saw. Let me skip back, actually. Yeah, and so this pattern that we saw back on this slide, where this was like the He, but the Yod He, and then that's 1 + 2 is 3, is Binah. That same sort of pattern is operating here. I maybe didn't say that extremely clearly, but hopefully everybody knows what I mean by that. One thing you can do here with the tetragrammaton arranged as a tetractys there is you can add up all the letter values. Now, normally the tetragrammaton has a value of 26, right? Yod, He, Vav, He. Yod is 10, He is 5, Vav is 6, and then of course the He final is also 5. So 10 + 5 + 6 + 5 is 26, and that's the normal value of the tetragrammaton. But we can also add up, all 10 letters that we see here, and that sums to 72. 72 is a really important number, and you'll see it all the time. There's something called the Shem Hamfarash, which is the 72 divine names that are used in ceremonial magic. You also have the 72 5-degree divisions of the entire zodiac, and a bunch of other important patterns as well. So 72 is a key number, and we'll see it again on the right here. So this is an idea that now, I assume most of you are familiar with the idea of spelling in full. Spelling in full is when you take, it's a Qabalistic technique, when you take a Hebrew word and then you spell out the name of each one of the letters, right? So the letters each have their own spelling. So, Yod is spelled Yod, Vav, Daleth. So you can then spell it in full, where you spell out, to spell tetragrammaton in full, you would spell out the name, the letter Yod as Yod, Vav, Daleth, then you would spell out He, then you'd spell out Vav, and then you'd spell out He, and then you can take the, the sum total of that and get an even, another and larger value. But there's an idea that with the tetragrammaton, this spelling in full is different in each of the 4 worlds. So let's see, maybe easiest to look from the bottom up. So in Asaya, here, this is the normal spelling of these, right? Yod is Yod, Vav, Daleth. He is just spelled He, He. Vav is spelled Vav, Vav. And then He again is spelled He, He. So this is the kind of standard or like basic default way that we would spell the tetragrammaton in full. And then in the other 3 worlds, we've got extra either Aleph or Yod, which are both these pseudo vowels, inserted. So the Yod itself never changes its spelling. It's always spelled Yod, Vav, Daleth in all 4 worlds. And that's significant. The idea that the Yod, the divine source, the essence, it never changes. It always remains just what it is, because that's sort of its essence. It's the thing that always remains just what it is. But it's the spellings of the He, Vav, and final He that change. So in Yetzirah, you have an Aleph being, so He is spelled He Aleph, and then the 2 He's are always spelled the same way. He is spelled, He Aleph, and then Vav is spelled Vav Aleph He. Then when you go to the world of Berea, you see that the spelling of He has changed. So now Vav is still spelled Vav Aleph Vav, but He is now spelled He Yod. And then when you get to Atziluth, He is still spelled He Yod, and now Vav is Vav Yod Vav. And so you can see that if you compare like Yetzirah, the spellings in Yetzirah and Atziluth there, Yetzirah is adding Alephs to the spellings, and then Atziluth is inserting Yods, and then Berea is like a mixed, right? Berea is using both the Aleph and the Yod. So you can see the idea of the Yod as the higher here and the Aleph as lower, and then Berea as like the thing in the middle. So there's a really nice pattern going on there. All right, and now this secret number that you see in the column to the right, that's the value of the spelling in full in each one of the 4 worlds. And then from that secret number, you also generate a secret name. Now, this secret name is just the like Hebrew representation of that number. I've used we've got the final value here of noon, but we're not using final values here. So 52 is just written as the 50 and the 2. Now this one is rearranged a little bit. Normally it would be like noon Beth, but it's been rearranged to Beth noon because Ben is the word for son, right? And so that the Vav, the son of Tetragrammaton, in the mother, father, son, and daughter, that's the name Ben, which has the value of 52. Now the name in Yetzirah sums to 45, and so that generates the secret name Ma. The number 45 is an extremely important number. It's the value of Adam, the atom, who we'll see in a minute as the primordial human. Very important number. And then we've got the divine, in the same thing in Berea and Atziluth. We have secret names generated from those numbers. And again, we see that the secret number of Atziluth, 72, is the same as the value of the Tetragrammaton arranged as the Tetractys, the 72 again. So there's a lot more here, and there's a lot more that you can look into. All 4 of those numbers are really interesting, and there's a lot of other like gematria and patterns and things like that here that's really, really worth looking into. This is just a really basic introduction to that. All right, so I want to take a minute to talk about, we talked about the clip-off, the world of the shells or husks, so I did want to spend a minute talking about that. First, just kind of general comments. The clip-off is not an extremely important part of our tradition or our system. It's become really emphasized in certain modern schools of magic. I think a lot of that's coming through like Kenneth Grant and into the Typhonian tradition, and then gets picked up by a lot of others who really turned it into something much more important than it is. So I think there's not a lot of reason to put like a strong emphasis on it. And again, it's not an extremely important part of the Golden Dawn or Thelemic systems, but you will see it and it is important. So what exactly the Qliphoth are, again, this is like the shells or the husks. This changes a lot in very different contexts. So in my understanding anyways, like in the Zohar, the Qliphoth is like matter in and of itself, matter that is no longer being informed by spirit. Like matter separated from the divine source. If you remember back when we talked a little bit about like Plotinus's model of the universe, you could think about the way that he talks about matter as something that in itself is like unknowable. It just sort of has to be there for like theoretical reasons. That matter itself is something that we can't like directly even experience. It's just the lowest point. So in this sense, there's nothing like evil or dark about it. It's simply the lowest point of the creation. You have the extending from the Godhead in itself down to matter as the lowest part. The Qliphoth are matter considered on its own, matter that isn't being infused by spirit. So that's in the Jewish tradition, right? And in the Jewish tradition, there's no hell, like at least not like a Christian hell. There's the idea of Sheol, which is a little more like a kind of Greek idea of like Hades. It's a place, a kind of realm of the dead, but it's not like a real afterlife. They're just sort of shades or like shadows of the living persons, but not really an afterlife, and not a place of punishment or anything like that. But in the medieval tradition, right, in the Christian like magical traditions, in the medieval and Renaissance traditions, this stuff gets sort of mixed up with Christian ideas about hell, and it becomes more evil and more sinister. Let's see, a few other things. Oh, right. Also, sometimes in the Zohar and the Jewish tradition, you have the idea of the Qliphoth or shells as being like the remnants of past worlds. Sometimes there's the idea of previous worlds having existed before like the current creation, and in a way that's a little bit reminiscent of like the Maya cosmologies, where you have like multiple worlds that are created and then destroyed, and then the new worlds are created out of like the pieces of the destroyed worlds. Yes, you have that sort of idea. Now, in the more modern, like Golden Dawn and into the kind of Thelemic traditions, you have some other ideas developing as well, such as the idea that the Qalipoth are something like sort of forms or things that have either become unbalanced or are no longer connected to their source, like they're things that sort of hang around longer than they're supposed to be, or something like that. And so, kind of spiritualist ideas from the 19th century are definitely relevant here. The idea of like, spirits who don't pass on to the next world but remain lingering in this one or something like that. I think some of those types of ideas come in. There's also a psychological interpretation of them where they can be parts of like especially when looking at like Qabalistic psychology, which we'll talk about more in a little while. The Qalipoth can be things like, kind of older patterns, maybe like things from your past or things from childhood that still kind of like hang around and influence the way that you do things, but are not helpful and are not beneficial. And so they're like the husks or shells of older patterns. All right, so I've got some quotes here. Let's see. We need to speed up a little bit here. But yeah, I've got some quotes here from the Chaldean oracles. Now, these are both things coming in from, or the Chaldean oracles, isn't coming in from the Kabbalistic tradition. This is the Greek, Platonic and Neoplatonic traditions. But they're really important for the Golden Dawn, and I think the way that they present this kind of lower world is very influential on the way that Qalipoth get looked at. So these are three independent, quotations in the collection of the Chaldean oracles. So we've got, "Stoop not down unto the darkly splendid world, wherein continually lieth a faithless depth, and Hades wrapped in clouds, delighting in unintelligible images, precipitous, winding, a black, ever-rolling abyss, ever espousing a body unluminous, formless, and void." Right? And then we've got, "Stoop not down, for a precipice lieth beneath the earth, reached by a descending ladder which hath 7 steps, and therein is established the throne of an evil and fatal force." And then finally, "Stay not on the precipice with the dross of matter, for there is a place for thy image in a realm ever splendid." So you can see here that they are being associated with Hades, but also with matter and with the lowest points and the darkest, the things that are the furthest from the divine illumination. And the advice is to look upwards, look upwards to the divine source rather than looking downwards into the created world and into matter. Now, in the Thelemic Holy Books, this same idea is taken up and developed in a different way. So this is from Liber Ararita. "I reveal unto you a great mystery. You stand between the abyss of height and the abyss of depth." There's another, this abyss of height and abyss of depth, we could think of this as, the Qalipoth are like the abyss of depth, and then the higher worlds, the divine worlds are the abyss of height. Another way, and I think a way that Crowley looked at this idea is also about the scale of the physical universe. Now, I think Crowley believed that this was more exactly true. From the perspective of modern physics, this is only like approximately true, but it's approximately that the ratio of the scale of the entire universe to like the human scale, like the size of the human body, is approximately the same as the ratio of the human body to the smallest subatomic particles. Now, again, I think with the discovery of like the Planck lengths and all that, I think that it goes a little bit further down than it does up. But you again have this basic idea that the universe is the smallest particles are as smaller, to us as the universe is larger, and that we're right in the center between the height and the depth. And it's another sort of microcosm, macrocosm idea. And the human as the microcosm, the thing that links and bridges the highest and the lowest. All right. So picking back up with verse 34 there. "In either awaits you a companion, and that companion is yourself." Again, the idea of a reflection, that you have a reflected companion in the higher world and a reflected companion in the lower world. "You can have no other companion. Many have arisen being wise. They have said, seek out the glittering image in the place ever golden, and unite yourselves with it," right? To seek the higher world. "Many have arisen being foolish. They have said, stoop down unto the darkly splendid world, and be wedded to that blind creature of the slime." So now, obviously echoing the language of the Chaldean oracles there, but now, advising that you stoop down rather than that you don't. I, who am beyond wisdom and folly, and wisdom is Hokmah, and folly is Aleph. So that's the second highest, right? So yeah, this would be Hokmah, and then Aleph would that path there. I, who am beyond wisdom and folly, meaning like Kether, I, who am beyond wisdom and folly, arise and say unto you, achieve both weddings, unite yourselves with both. Beware, beware, I say, lest ye seek after the one and lose the other. My adepts stand upright, their head above the heavens, their feet below the hells. So now the idea of achieving both weddings, not seeking the higher and not the lower, but doing both. And again, that idea of my adepts stand upright, their head above the heavens, their feet below the hells. The adepts are a microcosm who comprehend all the way from the heights to the depths. Now, these two things, they might seem like incompatible advice, but there's no reason that in practice that there is an incompatibility. We might think that the advice of the Chaldean oracles is good practical advice, especially early on in the path, and then Liber Ararita presents a more ultimate perspective. And so I think that the smart and sane sort of way of approaching this is to say that, while there's no need to be fearful or superstitious or to absolutely avoid the Qliphoth or avoid the lower worlds, to try to work with them before having made the connection to the highest is going to result in error and deception and delusion. And so the idea is that you first make contact with the upper worlds and the higher worlds, and then eventually, as more advanced work, you can then extend your awareness and your work down into the lower worlds as well, and eventually encompassing and uniting everything. Because our perspective is always non-dualistic. So whatever the Qliphoth are, they're not something. This isn't some sort of, there's no basic division into good and evil or above and below. There is only the one continuous cosmos that, or the continuous divine reality that encompasses everything, and that includes whatever the Qliphoth are. Now on the tree there, I've just given English translations. I decided not to give the Hebrew names for the Qliphoth. Again, there's no reason to be like superstitious or fearful about it, but it seemed smart to not do anything to invoke these forces, at least not in this place. So there you can see some of the names, and you can see the way that they are like evil or distorted or imbalanced reflections of the Sephiroth. Like Kether is really clear, right? Kether normally is the one undivided singular unity, but the Qliphoth of Kether is the dual contending forces, right? Tefereth is the place of beauty and harmony, right? But the Qliphoth of Tefereth is the disputers, right? Two things who are disputing are not in harmony. And then finally, maybe worth saying really quick, in Malkuth there, I have Lilith. Sometimes Lilith is given as the evil woman or the woman of night. And there is an etymological link between Lilith and the Hebrew word for night, like nighttime. That is interesting there. But yeah, just something to sort of be aware of. And there's a lot of different ways that Lilith gets talked about, especially in kind of modern and traditional, like sources and things like that. So just something to pay attention to about the context that things are being used in. Yeah. All right, so let's just move on here. Oh, you know what? I realized I wanted to read that John Michael Greer quote a minute back. Let me just skip back to where I was going to read that. Yeah, here we go. So this is slightly out of order here, but again, I think we built up some of the ideas of the four worlds, and I think it now will make more sense. Actually, let's do this one instead. Here we go. All right. So so this is a couple pages later. Greer says, the core of the Golden Dawn approach was a return to something like the astrological theory of magic, but with a crucial difference. So he's saying that in a way the Golden Dawn returned to more of a traditional approach, like from Levi, but it has incorporated some of the changes that Levi made. So they returned to something like the astrological theory of magic, but with a crucial difference. Where the old astrological mages had understood the different realms of being as separate in space, the elemental world below the moon, the planetary realm above the moon but below the stars, the empyrean beyond the stars, the Golden Dawn interpreted them as planes or modes of being that were simultaneously present in every corner of space. In the order's Qabalistic jargon, you've got the divine realm of Atziluth, the archangelic realm of Bria, the angelic realm of Yetzirah, and the material realm of Asaya. The latter is the only one human beings normally perceive, but all are present at every point in space and time. Golden Dawn initiates thus didn't need to direct their attention to a distant realm beyond the stars, or wait for the planets to come around to favorable positions in order to work magic. Instead, they had to open up contact with more exalted planes of being, using ornate ceremonial and an assortment of more or less intricate psychophysical techniques. They weren't using their own wills and imagination to transform the world directly. That would be like what Levi was suggesting. They were, like the astrological mages of old, tapping into the creative process that brought the world into being. But they were doing it in a way that wasn't inconvenienced by the Copernican cosmos or dependent on the cycles of heaven. Notice also that the Golden Dawn model gives a more important role to the individual mage than the old astrological magic did. A Golden Dawn adept didn't simply wait patiently for the influences to descend. He or she tore open the walls of the sky to summon down the influences needed for a particular working. Yeah, so hopefully that's sort of helpful in thinking about these different perspectives. And I think, yeah, one thing that I find powerful about this idea is that the Golden Dawn are in a way, or at least beginning to. Now, we can each find our own place of balance here, but I like at least the idea that although they're sort of following after Levi in this more modern kind of like Copernican sort of way of thinking about magic, but still using the older ideas and trying to incorporate the two together and reconcile the two, and be able to use the older ideas in a way that, like I think Greer says, isn't inconvenienced by the heliocentric model. Yeah. So, anyways, there you go. So yeah, that plus the clip up basically finishes off our little tour through the worlds there. And now we can switch and talk a little bit about the ideas of like the soul and the parts of individuals as related to the tree, and human psychology and the soul. All right, so I've mentioned this already before, but this is, we have the idea of the Adam Kadmon, who's the primordial human. Now again, Adam, is the name of the man in the garden, but in the Kabbalistic tradition, Adam is taken as the primordial human, and in a way, talking about Adam as like the human race itself. And so again, we can think of this as an androgynous thing, not as masculine, even though it's emerged from a patriarchal culture, and so they're using men as the default for all of humanity. But we don't need to understand it that way, and we can understand Adam as as sort of both male and female, or beyond that. All right, so on the left, I've given what are useful and practical correspondences between the Sephiroth and the parts of the body. And then on the right, I've got a diagram of the Sephiroth. Now, this is like Adam Kadmon specifically. This isn't like just an individual human. This is the primordial human. Now they're a little bit different, so let's sort of talk through the diagram on the left, and then we'll look at the table on the left, and then we'll look at the diagram on the right. All right, so basically we're just mapping out from the top of the head down to the feet, and again thinking also about the pillars, about the left and right sides, and then the middle pillar as along the center of the body. So Kether is the crown of the head. We're just above the crown of the head. Hokmah is usually the left side of the head, and then Binah is the right side of the head. Da'ath is the throat. Hesed can be the like left shoulder and arm. Gevurah is the right shoulder and arm. And of course, you see that like in the Kabbalistic cross when you touch your left and right shoulders for Ve Gevurah and Ve Gedula. That's Hesed and Gevurah that you're touching there, right? And Gedula is an alternate name for Hesed. And Tefereth corresponds to the breast, or sometimes specifically to the heart. Netzach corresponds either to the left hip or leg, and then Hod is to the right hip or the right leg. Yesod corresponds to the genital center, and then Malkuth corresponds to the feet, or like the feet touching the ground, and then sometimes Malkuth also is seen as like the entire body. So in the right here, we see Adam Kadmon. Above his head there, we see the Ein Sof, the endless. Now, the attributions in this diagram are a little bit different and aren't quite as useful for like practical purposes, but you can see that Hokmah here is being attributed to his brain. Now Binah here is being attributed to his heart, and Tefereth is like the breast, or almost looks like the solar plexus there. So that's a little bit different than the way we do it, but that is a variation that you'll see. And then you see beauty here. Now, you'll notice that this seems to be mirrored left to right. This is following a Jewish tradition of never depicting like the face of God directly. You know, there's all that stuff about, you know, God like turns his back to Moses so that Moses doesn't like directly behold him. So following that tradition, certain like presentations of like the anatomy of God or of Adam Kadmon will be mirror imaged for Orthodox reasons. So you should be aware that that will happen, but in our tradition, we don't follow that. Although if you think of this instead as like a mirror image, this is like you gazing into a mirror, then it still works very fine. Then it works fine, but just know that the left and right will be flipped from what's normally on the Tree of Life. And so you can see Hesed here on the left, and then Gevurah on the right. Now, obviously, those are below Sephiroth, so this is being like modified from the Tree of Life. Now, that's fine. The Tree of Life is very flexible and can handle that kind of stuff. Though, again, if we think that these extend all the way up to the shoulders, it needn't be out of proportion there. And then there's Yesod at the genital center. You have Hod and Netzach here as the legs, though, of course, you can also put them on the hips if you want to maintain like the geometry of the tree a little bit better. And then finally, Malkuth at the feet. Oh, yeah, right. And the Pechad, meaning fear, is an alternate name for Hesed. Yeah. And I think that was one of the ones that we looked at back in the first class when we looked at some of the alternate names. So yeah, you should definitely be used to seeing sometimes, especially in looking at like 19th century sources and things like that. You'll sometimes see you know, like Gedula switched out for Hesed and Pechad switched out for Gevurah, or Din for Gevurah. You just have to get used to seeing that. But yeah, thanks for pointing that out. Okay, so let's look at another. Then we'll come back to some of that stuff about Adam Kadmon there. But here's another thing you'll see in some traditional sources. This is really big in the Zohar, especially the 3 books of the Zohar that Christian Norvan Rosenroth translates as the Kabbalah Data, and then McGregor Mathers translates into English as Kabbalah Unveiled. Those 3 books deal a lot with the thing called the Partsufim. Now, Partsufim is plural of Partsuf, which means, yeah, it can mean something like visage or persona. It may be a word that doesn't translate extremely well into English, and so you often just see Partsufim used as like a technical term and not translated. But it is something like, yeah, like persons or like visages or faces. Now, there's a lot of variation here, and then especially in the later, like Jewish tradition, like in the Lurianic tradition, this gets really elaborated and made really complex. So I've just given a really kind of basic outline here. So corresponding to, so you have, yeah, these are like persons or like visages that correspond to the Sephiroth. So corresponding to the Ein Sof, which I just listed here as the Godhead, right? The unlimited, the infinite. You have Atik Yoman, the Ancient of Days, right? And that's a phrase that gets used a few times in the Bible, of the Ancient of Days. Sometimes you also see Atik Kadisha, with the Holy Ancient One, that often gets put to Ein Sof as well. And for Kether, the crown, you have Arak and Pin. Sometimes Atik Yoman is also placed into Kether rather than into the Ein Sof, so you'll see that as well. Now, in Norvan Rosenroth's translation, he translates Arak Anpin. Arak Anpin, I think, literally means like long of face, or the long face. He translated it as macro prosopis, like the greater face, or or countenance. So this is the greater countenance or the greater face, which corresponds with Kether. And then for Hokmah and Bina, we have the father and the mother, which is a pattern we've already seen. So these can each be spelled 2 different ways. The father can be spelled as Ab, Aleph Beth, or as Abba, Aleph Beth Aleph. You'll see both of those. Just variations. Now for the mother, you have Ema. And then there's 2 different spellings, which I understand doesn't change the pronunciation. So it can be spelled as Aleph Mem Aleph or Aleph Yod Mem Aleph. Now, some authors, Crowley included, make a lot out of this idea of the Yod. And I think it's worth, I don't want to get too far off into that here, but I think this is something that's worth sort of thinking about critically. Crowley will sometimes talk about Amma, the Aleph Mem Aleph, without the Yod, as being like representing infertility and being like a formula of witchcraft in a negative sense. And then Ema with the yod, this represents like the feminine womb or the mother fertilized by the masculine, and then it's good. But now, obviously, I think a lot of us probably rightfully have a little bit of a reaction against this idea that like what's good for the feminine is to be fertilized by the masculine, and I think there's a genuine thought that that the feminine should be its own formula, and that like the virtue of women isn't determined by their ability to bear a man's children and all those types of ideas. So I think that's all worth really thinking about and thinking critically about. Let's see. And then we have, again, this pattern of the middle 6 Sephira of Hesed through Yesod of 4 through 9, all being grouped together. And this is the Zaire Anpin, the micro prosopis, the lesser countenance. And then finally for Malkuth, we've got a few different names. We have the Nukva, which means the female. We have Kala, which means bride. Malka, which means queen, and then Shekinah, which literally means like dwelling or setting. This is the Shekinah is the presence of God on earth in the Jewish tradition, but it's specifically portrayed as feminine. So God's presence within the world is a feminine presence. All right, and then we also see on the right there, I've given the tetragrammaton again. So again, there's father, mother, son, and daughter pattern is absolutely here, though here it's been more elaborated. And like I said, you'll see there's other parts of theme that get added. Sometimes this is done a little bit differently. There's other names that can be used, but this is a basic schema for you to know. And these ideas are really, really developed in, like I said, in the Zohar. There's whole chapters on the different parts of macroprosopis, where there's like the brain of macroprosopis and the forehead of macroprosopis, and there's a lot of stuff about the beard of macroprosopis, and his beard is actually divided into 13 parts, and each part of the beard gets its own whole chapter. So there's really a lot that's done with this. Yeah. And the macroprosopis and microprosopis have a relationship where the microprosopis gains its virtue from the macroprosopis. There's a lot of this stuff is really developed, so we can't go over it in any kind of complete way here, but important to know. And I'll show you the way that this shows up in a few different diagrams. So this is from Christian Nor van Rosenroth's Cabalo de Nidata, some of his illustrations. You got the full illustration on the left, and then a close-up, a detail on the right. And so you'll see that this is the Ancient of Days that we're looking at here. So at the top here we have that says Adam Kadmon. Now it actually says Adam Kadmon Shannai. I'm not entirely clear on what's going on with the Shannai here. Shannai usually means like second. So this is like the second Adam Kadmon, which does sort of have the idea of like the primordial man. Sometimes there's like more than one like version of him on different levels. So I think Nor van Rosenroth is sort of following that idea in some way, though I'm not exactly clear. And something I didn't say about Adam Kadmon, in some Jewish traditional sources, the Adam Kadmon is like a fifth world that's above even Atziluth. Now that isn't really part of our tradition and doesn't really work super well for the way that we do things, but do be familiar with the idea that sometimes Adam Kadmon is taken as a world in and of himself that lies beyond Atziluth. All right, so we've got, Adam Kadmon there. And then here we see the Atek Yoman, the Ancient of Days, right? And so this is the Ancient of Days. And you'll see sometimes that we'll talk about magical images for the Sephiroth in the coming class, the 5th class. And that is one of the traditional magical images of Kether, is a bearded ancient seen in profile. And so here you've got him here. You can see that his cranium has been cut away to show his brain. And there's there's obviously some actual like anatomical knowledge of the brain. There's going on with like in the Zohar. So people that must have had some kind of access to like dissection or some knowledge of anatomy, because they're talking about different cavities within the brain and different portions of the brain, and giving all kinds of attributions to the parts of the brain, which is really interesting. And then you see here, this is Arik Anpin, right? The macroprosopis. And then here you can see that's Abba and Ema, the father and the mother. So you can see in this diagram here, we've got this presentation of the Partsufim. All right, later diagram here. This is from Eliphas Levi. This is his the great symbol of Solomon, which means the hexagram, right? The hexagram is like the Star of Solomon, or the seal of Solomon is the hexagram. And so you've got, this is a kind of really cool diagram here, right? So this is like God, the face of God sort of brooding over the waters and is reflected in the waters. So you can see the way that God hit this stola day, right? Stola is like stole, ritual garment. So that's like the stole of God, and it's being reflected you can see in the reflection, the black and white are being reversed so that you get this like white upward pointing triangle and black downward pointing triangle. And this isn't the clearest version of this diagram or this image, but hopefully you can see that the face of God, the lower reflection, looks kind of scary and wicked. And this is an idea you'll see a lot in Eliphas Levi, the idea that Satan or the devil or evil is just the shadow cast by the good. So that it's, right, they're not actually like two contending forces. It's just that if you have the good, that necessarily like casts the reflection of the evil. Which is a really interesting idea, especially coming from a Christian. We've also got some Kabbalistic or Masonic symbolism here going on that we're not going to talk about. But you see quod superius, that which is above, and then macro prosopis, and then sicut is like, and then micro prosopis, right, the lesser countenance. So the greater countenance above, the lesser countenance below, and then also quod inferius here, that which is below. So Levi is directly relating, the Hermetic idea of as above, so below, to the idea of the macro prosopis, the greater countenance, and the lesser countenance. And I've also just grabbed some two kind of relevant quotes for this mythology of the idea of like the reflection in the waters. So from Genesis, you have the idea of the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. So the idea that God's visage is like reflected in the waters, and so that's like the micro prosopis is like the reflection of the macro prosopis. And now from the Corpus Hermeticum, you have a similar idea, but instead of being God that's reflected, it's the primordial human again. That's what the man being referred to here is that androgynous primordial human. When the man saw in the water the form like himself, as it was in nature, he loved it and wished to inhabit it. Wish and action came in the same moment, and he inhabited the unreasoning form. So again, the idea of the primordial man, the primordial human, now descending into the world because he's fallen in love with his own image in the waters. Obviously, there's the myth of Narcissus is probably being referenced here. So there's some really nice, like archetypal images here. Christopher says it's reminding of the what's that called, the Daiji, I think, the yin yang image from Taoism. Yeah, absolutely. The black and white is complementary reflections, and the division, right? And that's the idea too with that, right? That yin and yang are always, you can't have one without the other. They always form a pair and are what they are because of their relationship to the other. And so you can see some of that logic kind of happening in Levi with good and evil, which is, again, is very different than a more like traditional Christian interpretation where there is an absolute good and an absolute evil. Those are real independent things rather than like a division or something like that, or things that good is only good in relationship to evil. That's a very different sort of idea. But let's just keep moving on. We're definitely going to go a few minutes over. Let's just keep moving here. Okay, right. So this is from Kabbalah Unveiled. This is Mather's translation of Christian Nora von Rosenroth's Kabbalah Denudata. So we see a bunch of the things we've just been talking about. So you see at the top, you see quod superius, that which is above. And then in the middle, sicut is like, quod inferius, that which is below. So as above, so below. Now we have two hexagrams. The upper hexagram is the arc anpin, and that's the macro prosopis, the greater countenance. And then the lower hexagram is the Zaire anpin, the micro prosopis, the lesser countenance. Now, the upper countenance here is just being attributed to Kether, remember? And so these other 5 Hebrew words that you see here are just titles of Kether. So that's inscrutable height, the ancient one, let's see, which one is that? That is the smooth point, the white head, and then the primordial point. So those are just 5 other titles of Kether. And then we see in the hexagram of the microprosopis, we see that same group of the 6 middle Sephiroth centered around Tefereth, Hesed, Gevurah, Tefereth, Netzach, Hod, and Yesod. All right, so yeah, let's do parts of the soul here again. Just a few more things to get through here. All right, so the parts of the soul are a little bit complex because they can be divided and subdivided in different ways. So the most basic 3 parts are the neshama, the ruach, and the nefesh. That's what you see kind of right there in the center. Now, all 3 of these words are all appear in the Bible. They're not given like specific differentiated meanings. It's the later Kabbalistic scheme, Kabbalistic interpretation that works these out as, you know, as 3 different things, not just as synonyms. But all of them can mean both breath and spirit. And this idea of breath and spirit being essentially the same thing or represented by the same words or the same symbols is something you find in all sorts of ancient traditions. And in ancient languages like the Latin spiritus, the Greek pneuma, and the Sanskrit prana all have the same double meaning of breath and spirit. Yeah, and that's a really interesting thing. You even see, like in the reason that astrological horoscopes are cast for the moment of birth, you know, rather than like for the moment of conception or something like that, is that with the breath, you know, with the child's first breath, you know, that's when the spirit like inhabits the body. Before that, there's just like the lower, like sort of what Aristotle calls like the vegetative soul, but the animal soul comes in with the breath because again, the breath is the soul or is the spirit. All right, so yeah, so we have the neshama, the ruach, and the nefesh. We'll start maybe ruach, the center. This is like ordinary and also beyond ordinary, also like awakened level of the conscious ego, the rational faculty, the sense of self that we identify with. We're not necessarily aware of all of it, you know, all of the time, but it is the ego, the self, the I. Yeah, whether in someone who isn't fully awakened to the entire you know, scope of its nature or not, that's still ruach. And then you have the neshama is like in psychological terms, neshama is like the higher unconscious, like the Jungian unconscious, the spiritual unconscious. And the nefesh is like the lower unconscious, the personal unconscious. Nefesh also includes like nefesh is very similar to what we call the animal soul, or in the vegetative soul as well. The idea of like the vital, like life, the life force, the thing that actually literally gives like animation to the physical body. And a lot of this includes you know, kind of the idea of like the Freudian unconscious, things that you've repressed or aren't fully like consciously aware of. But it also includes things that are below conscious awareness but not repressed, like you know, like breathing when you're not paying attention to breathing, or the beating of your heart and the operating of all of those you know, like bodily processes. That's all nefesh that runs that stuff. And then yeah, and the neshama is like the higher soul, the higher unconscious, the eternal soul, right? Which normally we don't have access to, but through, you know, initiatory and magical and mystical work, you know, we can awaken to the neshama. Now, you'll sometimes also see grouped with these things what's called the goof. The goof isn't technically part of the soul, but is sometimes grouped with them. And goof is literally just the physical body. The goof itself is just the matter itself. The nefesh is like the vital thing that ensouls that and governs that. And we can think of both like sometimes I've seen the idea of like the etheric body being part of goof. Though often both the etheric and astral bodies will be like equated with nefesh. And then the neshama, the higher part of the soul, can be subdivided into its own trinity of the yechida. Yechida means something like the only one. And so again, this is the idea of like an absolute unity, a simple and absolute like point of identity and awareness. And then the kia means like life, and so this is like the divine life force, and is very, very similar to the idea of the true will. And then this is a little bit confusing, but the lowest part of neshama is also called neshama, and so this is like it's still individual soul. Now yechida is sort of beyond there. There's a sense in which like yechida is beyond, like, oh, you can't really talk about my yechida and yours or something like that. There is only that one single eternal consciousness. But with Neshama, it's getting a little bit personal. So it's the higher soul, but more like the higher soul of an individual. All right, so here's another diagram here. Hopefully this isn't horrifically confusing. So on the left, I've got the Sephiroth mapped out from, listed from top down, from Kether down to Malkuth. Now, I've got the parts of the soul done in two different ways, what I've called the sort of minimal way and maximal way, just with the fewest number of parts and then the most number of parts. So the minimal scheme there is just Neshama, Ruach, and Nefesh, just those three parts. And so Neshama corresponds to the supernal triad of Kether, Hokmah, and Bina. Ruach corresponds to that middle six that we've been seeing, and then Nefesh corresponds to Malkuth. Now, the six Sephiroth that make up the Ruach, each one of that can be divided up into six faculties of memory, volition, imagination, desire, intellect, and automatic consciousness. And if you've been following the series so far and have a basic sense of the nature of the Sephiroth, it should be pretty obvious how those faculties line up with the Sephiroth. If not, it's something worth sort of thinking about and investigating a little. And then to the right of that, I've got what I've kind of like the maximal presentation of the parts of the soul. So now the Neshama, which before was the supernal triad, has now been broken up into its three parts, where Yechida corresponds to Kether, the Chia corresponds to Hokmah, and then the Neshama in the more restricted sense corresponds with Binah. And so we can see the Neshama as like the part of the soul that receives the Chia, so that outpouring of like divine wisdom and divine life source. The Neshama is the receptive part that receives that. And that's like, the Yod and He, the father and the mother, the idea of the Yod as like that outpouring force, and then the He as like the womb that receives that and gives it form, and also makes it, so translates it down into the lower worlds. And so now on the bottom of the maximal arrangement there, I've put Guf to Malkuth and Nefesh to Yesod. So this is where you'll see the most sort of overlap or sort of ambiguity, is whether Nefesh is more Malkuth or whether it's Yesod, or maybe it's both. Sometimes you'll see almost the idea that like the Ruach and Nefesh both like overlap a little bit in Yesod. You'll see different ways of picturing that in different contexts. So yeah, just something to be aware of, and something worth thinking about the nature of Yesod, and how maybe there's a sense in which it's more like Ruach, and there's another sense in which it's more like Nefesh. But again, it depends on the context and whether we're looking at Malkuth as just the physical body or something beyond that. But again, this is the type of like flexibility that you need to have to be able to work with these things and understand them in different contexts. And then I've also given approximate correspondences to the four worlds and to the tetragrammaton. That should be pretty obvious by now. So let's just keep moving on. Hopefully just about 10 or so more minutes, and then we'll be done for today. All right, so now here's the parts of the soul again, and I've just put them on the tree. So on the left there, you've got Yechida there in Kether, Chia in Hokmah, and then Neshama in Binah. And then you see the middle six Sephiroth there, that's the Ruach. And then I've put Nefesh at the bottom in Malkuth. Excuse me. And then on the right, I've just given you the six faculties, or like the six parts of the Ruach, and how they correspond to the Sephiroth. So you see their memory and volition, or Hesed and Gevurah. And then imagination is Tefereth right in the center. And then desire and intellect are Netzach and Hod, and then the automatic consciousness is there in Yesod. All right, so this is another diagram from the Kabbalah Unveiled. The diagram itself is a little difficult to read, even printed. So I assume that you can't really read very well the smaller text. So I'll read everything out there. And actually, I've got the copy of the book, which is easier to read. But just notice, there are four spheres here. The upper sphere, that says Kia, right, which we've just been talking about, the Kia, the part of the soul. And here it says, what is that? From Atziluth, the world of archetypal forms. Oh, that's something to be aware of with Atziluth. Atziluth will often be translated as archetypal world. I think that is more misleading. I mean, in and of itself, Atziluth might translate well as archetypal, but it's confusing, I think, for us because usually when we're using the word archetype or archetypal, we're referring to Jungian psychology, but the Jungian archetypes don't correspond to the world of Atziluth. The Jungian archetypes would be like in Berea, so calling Atziluth the archetypal world is just going to be confusing, but you will see it, especially in like pre-Jungian sources. Mathers doesn't know Jungian psychology, obviously, so that's not an issue for him, but just something to be aware of. So Hia here is being said to issue from the world of Atziluth, the divine realm. And then here you have Neshama, and that says from Bria, the world of creation. And then Ruach, from Yetzirah, the world of formation. And now here we have from Messiah, or the material and sensuous world. Let's see, therefore being the reflection and realization of the preceding Trinity, meaning that Asaya, reflects and unites the previous three things. And you also see that within Asaya, you've got, this is another interesting way of arranging things. You've got an entire tree here, and the middle six here now are being called Nefesh, and then you've got Kether, Hokmah, and Bina above them. Now the middle six are being called Nefesh, and this is specifically like the tree within Asya. This particular scheme, I don't think I've ever seen used anywhere else. But this is the type, again, this type of like flexibility and the things that you can do once you're conversant with these things. They can be rearranged and reconfigured, to express different things in different contexts. And so you can see how this is being done in that diagram here. And then Malkuth at the bottom there. All right, so I'll just read the text now too, now that you've seen the structure of the whole thing. All right, so around the top circle, around Kia, it says, Kia, the highest form from Atziluth, the archetypal world. Therefore, the intangible, illimitable, indefinable idea in the soul of the great absolute, incomprehensible God, therefore analogous to macroprosopis. All right, now around Neshama here, the second one down, we read Neshama, the second form from Berea, the world of creation, the highest governing creative ideas, the aspiration to the ineffable one in the soul. Therefore, analogous to the letters Yod-He conjoined in Berea, coexistent, consubstantial, the connecting link between macroprosopis and microprosopis, the supernal father and the supernal mother. All right, and then in Ruach, the third sphere down, we read Ruach, the third form, from Yetzirah, the world of formation, the mind, the reasoning power, that which possesses the knowledge of good and evil, the power of definition, limitation, deduction, and conclusion, therefore analogous to the letter Vav, microprosopis, the sun. Right, and then finally the text around Messiah here. We read Nefesh, the fourth, from Messiah, the material world, the realization and completion of all things, that power in the soul which represents the passions and physical appetites, therefore analogous to the letter He, final, the bride of microprosopis, the lamb's wife of the apocalypse, who is the sum of all. So there's a reference there to the book of Revelation at the end. But hopefully that brings some of the stuff together. We see there the relationship to the letters of Tetragrammaton, to the four worlds, to the parts of the soul, to the parts of theme, the four worlds. I may have just said that twice, but yeah, right. So this kind of ties together a bunch of the things that we've seen so far. Okay, so that was a lot, but and I know it was a little bit hard to sort of structure everything. Each idea kind of relies on all the others to really be understood, so it was a little bit hard to find a good natural order to present things in. But hopefully some of those pieces are starting to click together in a useful way. All right, so real quick, I want to give you an exercise that you can work with. A bunch of you are probably already familiar with this, but if you're not, this is a really just sort of simplified version of the middle pillar ritual, which, again, like some of the pentagram rituals, could be thought of as more like a template rather than a particular ritual. There's lots of ways that this can be elaborated. You can add things, you can change things around, you can add more. You can either add the other like Sephiroth and centers that aren't included here. You can add colors. You can add all kinds of other things, other divine names. And so this is really like a basic pattern. So I've given you a simplified version of it. But hopefully you'll see as we go through it that it relates to a lot of the things that we've been talking about today, and is a nice way of putting some of these ideas into practice. And practice of actually doing magic, not just thinking about these abstract ideas. All right, so before you do the middle pillar, you should do the lesser banishing ritual, the pentagram. It's important to have that sort of clean slate, sort of sterilizing your lab equipment, as a friend of mine used to always say about the LBRP. Right. I'm sure most of you know how to do the lesser ritual, the pentagram. If you don't, you should learn how to do that and get some practice with it before working with the middle pillar. The middle pillar is not advanced, but is definitely a step beyond working with the lesser ritual, the pentagram. All right, and then the second step here, I've seen this in a couple of different, there's lots of different versions. Israel Regardie, I believe, was the first one to really work this ritual out, but there's lots of other different versions. And so I'm drawing on Regardie, I'm drawing on a version presented by Jim Eshelman. There's another interesting versions presented by like Melita Dennings and Osborne Phillips. So I'm sort of drawing from a number of different ones to give you my own kind of synthesis and simplification of them. So this, I recommend visualizing like an auric egg around the body. Again, that's an optional thing, but I found it very effective and is a really nice way of like setting up the space where everything else will take place in. And with the idea of generating all the light out of the other centers, having the idea of like a container for that light to like concentrate it within yourself seems to work nicely. So that's something you can experiment with and something that I like doing. All right, and now you're going to visualize spheres of light at these 5 centers and intone divine names that correspond with them. So at the crown center, which corresponds to Kether, you're going to visualize a sphere of intensely brilliant white light. It's not just the color white, it's more like, if you've ever seen like burning magnesium, like this really, it's like whiter than white, a really like intense, brilliant white light. The more that you can create that like imagined visualized intensity, I think the better your results will be. So so just above the crown of your head, a sphere of white light, approximately 3 inches to 5 inches in diameter. You can find sort of what feels best, but it shouldn't be too much smaller or too much larger than that. And now while concentrating on the center, you will intone the divine name of Kether, Eheye. You'll vibrate this, just as you would vibrate divine names in the lesser ritual, the pentagram. And you can imagine that the name is issuing from this center itself, which is a powerful technique. All right, and so you'll do that 3 times. You'll keeping your concentration on that center. You'll 3 times will intone Eheye. Now you'll imagine a shaft of white light, somewhat thinner than the sphere itself, but not just like a little line. A decent like shaft of light, and that'll descend down to the throat. Now, this should be like the throat, kind of in the front, not on the spine. It's important to distinguish these centers from the chakras. All right, so if you're to the throat, again, you're forming a white sphere. Now, a more advanced version of this is to start adding different colors to them, but I'm presenting them all here as white, which is a good place to start. And again, you'll see variations in which divine names, which there can be more or fewer centers, but this is one version of it. Right, so then throw it at the center, and now you're intoning Elohim. Elohim is the name used for Binah, but here we're kind of associating with the Da'ath center, and the idea of Da'ath and or Binah as like the thing that is the link between like the supernal and the below the supernal. So that's the idea of Da'ath here, is that which links the supernal triad to the 7 Sephiroth below. So the idea of a connecting point. But in between head and body, right? Makes sense. All right, so same thing, focus on that, intone the divine name Elohim 3 times, imagining the name issuing from that center. Then a similar shaft of white light descends to the heart center. Now you'll visualize a sphere of white light at the heart center. It's nice to do this have the sphere like halfway inside of your chest and halfway inside of your chest. It should be in the center though. Obviously the actual physical heart is a little off to the left side of the body, at least in most people. But you can do it like right in the center, but at the level of the heart, so half inside the chest and half out. And now the full name for For Tefereth here is Yod He Vav He Eloah V'Da'ath, but as we talked about before, this can be abbreviated to EIO, and that's a lot easier to vibrate. And EIO is a powerful set of vowels to vibrate. So you do that 3 times, then the white shaft descends to the genitals, and a similar sphere of white light at the genital center. Again, you can do sort of approximately half inside of the body, half out, whatever feels most comfortable to you there. Now again, concentrating on that, imagining the name issuing from that center, you'll intone Shaddai El Hai, which is the divine name of Yesod, which corresponds to the genital center. And Kai there is related to Hia, like that idea of life and the life power. All of that stuff is connected to the to Yesod and to the life force, to the generative force, to the creative power. All relevant there. And then finally, the shaft of light descends to between the feet. And now the sphere of the feet can be imagined as sort of half above the floor, half below the floor. And it's nice to imagine it like large enough to touch like the insteps of the feet. And like in Melita Dennings and Osborne Phillips' work, they actually talked about the soles of the feet as actually being like a like a particular like center of power, and energy within the human body. Now for the grounding center, there's a number of different names that get used for Malkuth. Most of them involve Adonai in some way. So I've just presented it simply here as Adonai. You can also use Adonai Haaretz or some of the other names that we've seen corresponding with Malkuth. All right, and then you're basically just going to do all of that a second time, except the second pass through, you'll just vibrate each name once. This is an idea I got from Jim Eshelman, and others have used it as well. The idea is that you first like slowly establish the centers and really build them up and get them all in place and get the whole system sort of connected and working. And then you go back down through another pass, which really helps to bring in the sense of like a momentum of something flowing from the highest to the lowest that you don't get as much when you go through more slowly. And also I found that once I've established all the centers, then going back and working on them again, there's a lot more like power and intensity available once everything has been like connected together. And then for the 13th step there, you'll see in more elaborate versions of the middle pillar, there's different like circulations of light that can happen that they kind of resemble some like Taoist internal alchemy processes of like circulating light and energy through the body in different ways. That's a great, more advanced thing to add, but you can also just simply do the Qabalistic cross, which accomplishes the same thing of balancing and equilibrating both vertically and horizontally. So yeah, again, this is just a basic, simple scheme that you can use and that can be more elaborated as you get more advanced and as you learn more correspondences and things. Let's see, I saw a couple of comments come in while I was going through that, so let me take a look at those. Yeah, let's see, Stephen's saying that he's found the middle pillar to be a great way to personalize or embody some of the Qabalistic framework and take it out of the theoretical. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly why I'm presenting it here too. And to, not just to personalize and embody it, but also to make it practical too, to show that you can actually employ these ideas directly in using magic, not just in relating to yourself and your own body and your energetic body, but as an actual practical thing that's used for magic. So yeah, great comment. Yeah, and then Christopher's commenting that, great application relating the lower to the higher, lesser to the greater. Yep, as above, so below. That was our theme for the class, right? Let's see, yeah, Christopher's saying he took a screenshot of the ritual to go over it further and practice later. Okay, yeah, thanks, Christopher. You might already be gone. I think he is. But yeah, for members, I'll put the slides up on the forum. Actually, for everyone, this video will be available on YouTube in the next, I don't know, probably 4 or 5 days. Okay, so yeah, suggested practices for the next 2 weeks like we've been doing before. So my main suggested practice is just to practice the middle pillar. Open with the LBRP. If you're not very familiar with the middle pillar, especially if you're newer to magic, you might want to begin with doing 2 to 3 performances per week. Again, it's not a particularly advanced ritual, but it is, a step beyond and is more energetic than the lesser ritual of the pentagram. So if you have trouble with it, it's likely to be one of 2 things. Either you're going to do it and just not really get much of a result at all, which is fine. It just means that you need to sort of keep practicing until eventually you figure out how to do it, or maybe even until you develop the sensitivity to be aware of what it is already doing. Sometimes things work before we realize that they're working. And some people may have the experience, again, this is a different yeah, some people seem to be more susceptible to this than others, of being able to like turn things on and bring in more energy that they then have trouble sort of dealing with, and you can feel kind of over-energized. There can be trouble sleeping and things like that. Again, nothing, you're not going to like blow up or anything like that. Nothing to be fearful of or superstitious with. But you know, maybe at first, instead of doing this every single day, you could do it, you know, a couple times a week or 3 times a week. See how that feels, and then progress from there. And then also, it's just you continue the process of memorizing this stuff. So from the previous weeks, you know, Sephirothic names in English and in Hebrew, the divine names, the numbers of the Sephiroth, and maybe some of the other sacred numbers connected to those as well that we've seen. The planets and the cosmology that we saw last week, you know, like the spheres of the planets, you know, the sphere of the zodiac, the prima mobile, all that stuff. And then also the elemental patterns that we saw last week. And we saw some elemental patterns this week as well. Like when we saw the tetragrammaton on the tree, that gave another way of looking at the 4 elements on the tree. So getting some of that down. And I'm suggesting from this class, although we went through a lot of stuff here, the real key things to take away were the 4 worlds and their names, both in English and in Hebrew, and also their basic attributions, like their attributions to the letters of tetragrammaton, their the hierarchies, you know, the fact that it's like the divine world, the archangelic, the angelic, and the material. Yeah, letters of tetragrammaton, the 4 elements. That stuff is really good to have with all 4 worlds. How to place them on the tree, and the idea that the tree can be placed in all 4 worlds. And then also the parts of the soul, both in Hebrew and English, and how those correspond to the parts of the tree. You know, the stuff about the Partsufim, I think it's nice to have been introduced to that for if you see it later and adds more depth. But you know, I wouldn't worry about memorizing that, especially if you're relatively new to this type of stuff. Yeah, so that's my suggestions for the next 2 weeks. Yeah, thanks everybody. If anybody has any questions, we've already gone almost 20 minutes over, but I'm happy to hang out for a few more if anybody has anything else. You know, for more info about our work, both our academics and initiatory tracks, you can visit TOS.org, and you can go to our FAQ. There's my email address if you want to get in touch with me personally. And we do have a $5 suggested donation for anyone who's not a member of the academic or initiatory track, and you can send that to payments@tots.org via PayPal. So yeah, so these last 2 classes definitely formed a sequence, and then we'll be shifting gears a little. In the next class coming up, we'll go through Sephiroth by Sephiroth and look at the remaining core. We've already done a lot of the basic correspondences and ideas to the Sephiroth, but building up more of the practical correspondences like gemstones, incense, plants, animals, you know, deities, things like that. We'll also look a lot at the hierarchies corresponding to the Sephiroth in all 4 worlds. You know, we'll look at all the names and different orders of angels. We'll also look at the color scales and some other ideas. So we're building up a lot of that with the Sephiroth next week on the foundation that we've been building up so far. So yeah, thanks everybody. And like I said, this was definitely the most, I think, complex of the classes. So yeah, if you didn't sort of get all of that or things aren't clear, you know, feel free to write to me. But you know, also just know that it's good to be introduced to the stuff, and you can always come back to it later. All right, I don't see any questions coming in, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. Yeah.